Good morning, everybody. Nice to see some people turning up to this. My name's Tyranid, and I'm going to talk about PSP development, sort of focus on sort of some of the demo aspects of it, some of the graphics work, and hopefully it'll be reasonably interesting. I did a similar presentation at Assembly last year, and because that was around about an hour and a quarter, I stupidly decided to split this into two parts. So there's a second part tomorrow. Today it's mainly sort of theory, going on about sort of the hardware, what's in the PSP, some of the software aspects of it, and then tomorrow will be more of a practical, so sort of going through using some of the dev tools, trying to draw some graphics, etc. So I begin. What this presentation covers, a bit of history of the PSP. The PSP's been around for about almost 2 years now, so there is some history now behind it, and also PSP internals. But I'm not going to obviously talk about games, piracy, mod chips, the usual sort of stuff, because that's obviously not remotely interesting. Right, and that's a rough overview, what I'm going to talk about. Depending on how much time I've got left, I'll probably remove the bit about security at the end, because it is really there for sort of interest's sake, and it can be fairly easily summarized. Right, so the history. Obviously, if you haven't have seen a PSP by now, there is a lovely picture of one. Timeline. So yeah, it's been, well, over 2 years now since the PSP released in Japan. And that was with the original 1.0 firmware. Sony have a habit of really messing up their original firmwares for their consoles. They generally have a lot of bugs, and as I'm sure people are aware, the PSP was no exception in that regard. It took until March before the PSP was released in America, and it came along with an upgraded firmware. And then in April that year, unfortunately just after Sony had done a presentation at Breakpoint about the PSP, the first homebrew was released by a Japanese hacker called Nem. And the usual sort of trick, do some hello world stuff in graphics. We saw it. But unfortunately that didn't run on the US one, so there was a large market of PSPs out there which obviously couldn't run homebrew. That was until someone found an alternative method of getting around this. And again, homebrew was enabled for everything. But it wasn't until September of 2005 that Sony finally got round to releasing the PSP in Europe. So once again, they'd managed to patch everything up by that point, and we were screwed again by Sony. So we had to wait for about 2 weeks until someone worked out basically how to exploit the PSP again and allowed you to downgrade back to a nice homebrew-friendly firmware. And so it goes on. I stopped after the sort of April because basically it's just a sort of chicken and egg scenario. Sony fixed something and the hackers came along and broke it again. So those are some of the revisions, some of the major revisions. There's a lot of little point releases where they fixed bits and pieces. But those little point releases are really there to remove exploits in the firmware. Now we're currently on 3.30 firmware, and ever since 3.10 there is no official way of getting code onto the devices. But fortunately, all firmwares which you can buy on a retail PSP at the moment can be downgraded to a sensible firmware revision so you can develop software for the PSP. One of the problems Sony brought upon themselves was because their original firmwares were so buggy, it has allowed people to produce a custom firmware for the device. So it allows you to have the benefits of having the latest firmware for running games and software, but also the old 1.5 mode for the old legacy homebrew applications. It also removes some of the protection inherent in the firmware, and also allows you to run plugins, so you can do something special while the PSP is running without having to modify the firmware itself. Right. running your own code. The PSP was originally built as an extremely secure system. It was not going to be hacked, apparently, according to Sony. Unfortunately, all it took was a special file to be created with a valid executable inside it, stick it on your memory stick, and it would run. That doesn't sound particularly secure to me. That was obviously fairly quickly fixed. After 1.5, they fixed that. And for the later versions, various different hacks, so using exploits in picture libraries and exploits in games, homebrew's been re-enabled. And once you can get onto the device, you can generally downgrade it and stick on something which is a bit more amenable to running software, rather than having to load up Grand Theft Auto and exploit it. So I can show how easy it is to actually run. Hopefully people can see this. So, if anyone hasn't seen it before, this is the main Sony menu. And obviously brings up their game software, but they also had a game setting for things on your memory stick. And surprisingly, if you set them correctly, you can just go to them, click the button, and it will run for you. Now this is actually running on a custom firmware, because it now brings so many advantages it's actually worth doing, but previously that would work on 1.5 or 1.0 quite happily. And obviously that's an absolutely fascinating bit of text displayed there, but I'll go into that later. So, right, so the hardware. The PSP is primarily a custom device. It's based off a MIPS CPU, but heavily modified for Sony's proprietary system. It also contains a second MIPS CPU in there, which is used for media processing, which also contains an FPGA for video decoding. It's got about 32 meg of RAM and 2 meg of video RAM, which doesn't sound an awful lot, and it isn't really. General purpose audio, so you can stream PCM to it, and very simple. A widescreen LCD, full color, which is actually quite nice, one of the best features of the PSP, it seems. Joypad, memory stick duo port, so you can have now up to 8 gig memory sticks for all your videos, apparently. I'm not sure how many people use it for videos. And other hardware, it just sort of keeps on going. Custom UMD device for obviously security reasons, so that no one could pirate their games, which didn't quite work out. USB, so it just goes on. The core of the PSP is this MIPS, custom MIPS processor, which Sony referred to as the Allegro X. It contains the basics of a sort of MIPS 32 core, but with extra instructions pilfered from other MIPS CPUs, sort of bit manipulation, use mode interrupts, and a CPU halt to try and reduce power consumption. It doesn't actually have a memory management unit. All it has is a simple sort of segment restriction system, so you have no translation look-aside buffer. You can just about put Linux on it, but for the most part it's not really worth it. Only a single precision floating point unit, but it does have a vector processor which allows you to manipulate four floating point values in one go, and also allows you to multiply matrices together, which is quite useful for 3D work. There's other little bits and pieces. They added some scratchpad RAM, which anyone who's done sort of work on the PS2 found was actually quite a useful addition to the hardware. And on the PSP, they screwed it up somehow, and it's absolutely useless, other than having it sitting outside of the normal RAM area. Right. So one of probably the most interesting parts of the main CPU is this vector processor, because if you can multiply two matrices together, it simplifies the code quite a lot, and it also should give some speed improvements. It's got the usual sort of raft of trigonometric and square root instructions, reciprocal instructions, and an onboard pseudo-random number generator. But yes, the registers are split into multiple different ways. At the top left, you can see you can have up to 16 singles addressed. The actual unit itself has 128 registers, so this is repeated, I think, 8 times. So you can have up to 8 matrices in memory. And you can also access them as columns, rows, matrices, and even the inverse matrices, matrix, all from a sort of simple bit of assembly code, which, okay, it's not that simple, but considering it is what, 7 lines long, that's actually only multiplying 2 matrices together, because most of that is actually loading it all into RAM. Although you can manipulate entire matrices in one go, for some reason you can't load an entire matrix in one instruction. You've got to load each individual column into the matrix, and then finally you can multiply them and store them back out to the memory. The graphics engine. For sort of demo stuff, that's probably actually one of the most important parts. Video RAM on the PSP is actually mapped into main memory. So it is possible to manually draw your graphics if you were so inclined. But that's not particularly a very good use of the system. The CPU is not exactly very fast, so you're not going to get much 3D performance out of drawing polygons manually. So the graphics engine has basically a simplistic GL-like API to it, and is based on a set of in-memory display lists. So even though you've only got 2 meg of VRAM, all this can actually be pulled out of main RAM. So you can pull textures, you can pull display lists out of main RAM instead of having to waste VRAM. However, main RAM slows it down considerably, so you're well advised to try and fit everything in some way into that 2 meg, or swap textures in and out of video RAM. Other useful features. A lot of texture formats. You got CLUT formats, so 4-bit, 8-bit color lookup table formats, paletted basically. DXT compression, full color textures, etc. It can operate in both a 2D and 3D mode, so rather than sort of the way sort of the PS2 tended to do it, which was sort of a virtual sort of pseudo 2D, 3D, you can actually give it your projection and your other matrices, and it will actually do the transformations for you and project it onto the screen. It has limited onboard clipping, but it is actually quite badly implemented, so you tend to lose polygons quite quickly. So unless you make all your polygons quite small, you're going to have to probably actually write your own 3D clipper, which seems to sort of waste your own time really in that. But it has other features. It can do splines, Bezier surfaces, also object morphing and skinning, lighting and stencil buffers. You can do shadows, alpha blending, logical operations, sort of stuff you'd want in a sort of basic sort of hardware graphics engine. All these are, or most of these are sort of documented in the software development kit with samples which allow you to sort of take them and hopefully reuse them in your own work. Display lists. As I said, graphics engine works on these display lists. I'm sure most people know roughly what we mean by that. So it's just a list of 32-bit instructions with an 8-bit command and 24-bit data. But even though you can pass floating point information in that, a single precision float is 32 bits. So if you've only got 24-bit of data, where does those other 8 bits go? Well, all they do is they truncate the bottom 8 bits off the floating point. So any floating point values you stick into these display lists is actually affected precision-wise, which is a bit unfortunate. But most of the time, you won't have to pass that information in the display list itself. You tell it where your vertices are, and these vertices can be custom formats, so you can have different sized positions, including 8-bit and 16-bit fixed points, 32-bit floats, various color formats, you name it. As I said, floats are clips on that. We are. So you build your list in memory, and then you finish it with a special finish command. And that then basically says, that's my list. Once the GE hits the finish command, it will stop and notify you of that. But you don't generally have to worry about all this. There's already libraries which handle the display list handling for you. But as an example of the sort of code you've got to do, you have to enqueue your list. You have to know what all the commands are, which they are documented somewhere, but not particularly well. Write back your cache, and then you can tell it to go off and do your work for you. And hopefully, if you've done it right, it will actually display something. I think this is the final bit on the graphics engine, hardware-wise. Swizzling. Now, the performance of, you can just pass textures in the normal, basically linear format, to the graphics engine, and it will display them. But unfortunately, it's not designed that way. If it's doing that, it has to do a lot of sort of bouncing around inside memory, which will affect your caching, and your performance suffers greatly from that. So if you do process of swizzling of your textures, it allows you to get considerably higher performance when displaying textures in your application. And the swizzling is based on blocks of 16 bytes by 8 rows, so if you pack your textures into these blocks of 16 bytes by 8 rows, it can read them sequentially, and you'll get considerably better performance. Now, there is example code in the SDK for this, so I'm not going to go into much more detail regarding that, but there is example of showing quite how much of a difference the swizzling can actually make to your performance. Right. Memory map. I said there was no general purpose memory mapping unit in the PSP, and there isn't. So how does it manage to actually separate between kernel and user mode? Because for security reasons, Sony would not want you to be able to manipulate kernel memory, because that's where all the security is. So there is that basic sort of segmentation memory mapping unit, which allows Sony to protect you from that. But that actually means you only end with actually 24 meg of user memory from your 32 meg, which seems a bit of a con. There is another 4 meg of volatile memory you can steal, but that can get lost, as its name would suggest, is volatile. All the devices are mapped into memory space. There's no sort of custom I/O address bus, and there is no virtual memory. So anything you would associate with doing virtual memory, being able to page out parts of your code, it's not possible to do. You have to fit it in within 24 meg. And that's some of the addresses you'll see. Because there's no virtual memory, these are all fixed addresses in the address bus. And so you've got your main RAM, 24 megs, kernel RAM, which you may or may not see, and VRAM. So if you start poking into VRAM at that point, you can affect the pixels directly. Right. So last section on this, which is probably actually the largest. The software. The PSP kernel is not just a single object file. It's all built up of little separate bits and pieces. And these are all loaded by the firmware at start time. But also, because of that applies also to your applications. And your applications are just extra modules loaded into memory when you run them. These can import and export functions, but probably for demo purposes this is mostly useless. However, a lot of the kernel functions to do things like the graphics and audio, etc., are all exported for you by the kernel. You don't have to link in large swathes of code into your own application, which can at least reduce the impact of having only 24 meg to begin with. But the kernel has no real concept of a process. It doesn't tie resources strictly to a single instance of one of these modules. So if you allocate memory and then you exit your process, it won't go away. It will sort of stay there unless you clean it up manually. That's because the kernel wasn't designed for that sort of operation. I can show you some of the modules they've loaded into the kernel. So there's a lot of them in there. But you shouldn't have to worry about these extensively. And for the most part, you don't really have to care whether they're there at all. You only have to care about your ones at the bottom, your own modules themselves. So, right. PSP has at least 3 executable formats. All of them are actually based off ELF, so they're not really different formats. Basic ELF is just a statically linked executable, whereas a PRX, which we think probably stands for PlayStation Relocatable Executable, is basically the same thing, but it can move around in memory, which has advantages, as you can load it into the lowest possible place in memory and save yourself some free RAM. You've also got the PSP format, which is their Sony encrypted wrapper, which, for whatever reason, Sony decided not to implement this across the entire board. It would have been considerably more secure if they'd made sure anything loaded into memory had to be in one of these files, but they felt that it wasn't worth the effort in that regard. Now the SDK, the free SDK, which you can get, is capable of producing these ELF formats, but it's not capable of producing the PSP ones. If we could, then there would be even less protection in the PSP. So it's a bit unfortunate that. Now, I showed you that list of modules, and it had sort of names and sort of bits of information, and this comes from your module information. If you don't have this in your program, it's not going to work, basically. But the SDK will do most of that for you. All you need is a special line in the file when you're compiling, and it will do all that work for you. So I'll probably show it tomorrow in the practical stuff a bit where it is, but it really is fairly simple. Earn library imports and exports. Probably the sort of most interesting part of this, because again, the SDK will hide a lot of this from you. You just link in a library, call a function, and all the sort of boilerplate bits and pieces will all be done for you. Probably the most interesting thing they did was when they identified the exports, which are sort of imported by ordinal, sort of like on Windows can do. They exported these ordinals as the first 32 bits of the SHA-1 hash of the name, which led to the interesting concept of we could do a brute force hash or a brute force attack on their function names. So function names we didn't know, we could brute force their SHA-1 hashes. And it was actually very successful in determining a lot of the internal kernel function names, which would otherwise be inaccessible to us. Now, because the kernel is modular, sometimes you need to load other bits and pieces into memory. This is where the load and start modules come in. Loading basically just brings that into memory, allocates it space, and creates an initial thread for it. And then the start module basically kicks off that thread, and your executable is now running. That would then pass off to parts of the SDK code to actually initialize the rest of your executable. But again, not much you have to really worry about in that regard. However, for security reasons, they won't let you load everything at any point, and that can actually cause serious problems. You don't have to worry about this so much if you use the custom firmware, because that's already moved half the checks out the kernel for you. Right. Right. As I said, PSP has no concept of processes. So, if you can't just get rid of a process and it all cleans up for you, how do you actually get the PSP back into a known state? And this is where these two sort of basic functions come in. Load exec reboots the entire kernel, and because it's all stored on flash, it's actually quite small. That's actually a fairly quick operation to perform. And kick off a new executable. An exit game will drop back out of your program and go back to that main sort of PSP menu. And you use that to get your system back into a clean state to which you can then run your own code again. But in normal operation, this is really terminating conditions. You don't have to worry so much about those. So, memory management. The kernel does have a memory manager, which the C library will utilize in order to give you sort of malloc and all that sort of stuff. And it splits the allocations into numerous partitions. So you've got kernel partition, which the user is not supposed to be able to access, user partition, etc. And it will track everything by unique identifiers and handle some other ancillary functions, including basic debug functionality. Unfortunately, because it's a consumer system, the PSP does not have any built-in debug functions. It has the stubs for it, but it doesn't have any actual debugger associated with it, which is something that the SDK people have been trying to rectify. So resource tracking, threads, modules, anything which it needs to track is all tracked using these unique identifiers, which are in effect just a encoded address. This allows the kernel to quickly look them up, find its control block, and actually do something with that. And with for the module list, all the unique identifiers are down that. So they're all sort of in sequential order, more or less, and that just reflects where in memory that address actually is stored. Right. Threading. One of the things to bear in mind with the threading on the PSP is it's not preemptive. Or preemptive in the sense of it is given a time slice, and if you're still running at the end of that time slice, it will kick you off the processor. If you do not relinquish control to another thread, or there's no other thread at a higher priority to take over, it will basically continue to run your thread, which can actually cause the kernel to completely crash on you, because even the kernel can't seem to preempt sometimes your own user thread, which seems a bit silly, really. So the scheduling is based on a priority system. The higher the number, the actual lower the priority is. It has a few bits and pieces. It has its own thread local storage. And it also controls whether you can use the vector processor. The vector processor has, as I say, 128 registers. That's a lot of data to context switch if you move between two different threads. So it assumes that if you don't say you want to use it, it will actually prevent you from accessing it, so that it can reduce its context switching overhead. Creating a thread is easy. You create a thread, give it a sort of nice fuzzy name, which doesn't actually mean anything, but it's just used for debugging purposes, and then you start it, and you can pass some arguments to it, and it's all very simple. There's not much more really to go on about that. It's arguably, for the most part, in demo sort of coding, you probably won't need to do these very often, other than for creating sort of threads for audio purposes. And that's the sort of rough state transition. It will go between sort of the ready, running, and waiting states. But it can also go to dead. If you get a stack overflow, because it's not virtual memory, you've got a very fixed stack, which is set when you create the thread, and if you go over that, it will just kill you. And generously, it won't even it will tell you it killed you, but it will only tell you through the low-level debugging information. So I've been asked a number of times why their application suddenly stopped running, and you can find out that they've just overflowed their stack, and it's just killed it silently for you, which is very generous of it. And you've got the usual raft of synchronization primitives, mutual exclusion, message posting. Most of them they're all sort of documented in the SDK, and I think they're all fairly easy to use. When you do need mutual exclusion, if you need to use, you can use semaphores, but that's going to waste a lot of time. So it's actually quicker to just disable interrupts. And once interrupts are disabled, other threads can't run because the context switching doesn't run anymore. Normally on a MIPS CPU, it wouldn't actually be possible to disable interrupts in user mode. But because of the security potential and the fact that they wanted to make it a games device, they gave you a special instruction in user mode to disable the interrupts. Event flags. You've got 32 bits. You can just say what events you want to signal, and another thread can be sitting there waiting until that event is actually sent to it. Now, callbacks. If you've used the PSP, when you run up a game, if you hit the home button, you get some sort of Sony supplied screen and says, do you want to exit your game? Once you click yes, the game has to notify the application that, or the kernel has to notify the application you've told it to exit, and this is what the callbacks are for. In this example, it's creating a callback to wait for that signal, and then it will call exit game, which will drop it back to the Sony menu. All very simple. And interrupts. That's a bit of code of how to get a vertical blank interrupt, which can be useful. You can use that at the point to swap your double buffering over, etc. So, because it's cooperative, ideally never sit in a tight loop. Otherwise, your kernel might not actually be able to reset. And make sure you get your priorities right. If you've got something, say audio, which works on a sort of interrupt sort of basis, you really want it to be at a higher priority than your graphics thread, which will be spending most of your time executing. So choose them carefully, otherwise you'll get virtual deadlocks with the cooperation of the threads. And make sure you delete the thread's resources. If you don't do that, you'll get memory leaks, but once you reset the kernel, it doesn't really matter anymore. Now, it'd be fairly useless if you had all this hardware and you couldn't actually load files into memory. So because you've got memory stick, you've got other file devices, you can just load your resources using a simple POSIX style API. Very, very simple. So SEIO open is basically synonym for open. And the file system works sort of similar to a Windows file system. You have a drive prefix. So say MS0 is your memory stick. Host0 is an extension for my dev tool, which allows you to run it off a PC. And then you just pass it a path. So that's your drive prefix / whatever. You can load it into memory. Right. Graphics libraries. Not really much to say about this, really. You've only got one mode. There is a display set mode, but you can only set it to one. We think this is probably sort of a thing for the development kits, the official Sony stuff. You can set different modes, but unfortunately for us, it's got to be there, otherwise it doesn't work. So, and then you set a frame buffer. Now this can be NVIDIA RAM. It can be main RAM. Set it to where you want, and then you can set 4 different color formats. You can have 32-bit color, But you can also have the free variants of 16-bit color up there, which will be RGBA, so you've got an alpha channel in that as well. And when you call wait vblank, it will actually do a wait. So if your thread calls that, it can allow another thread to run at that point. It is actually a proper wait point. It's not just a infinite loop checking on a bit in memory. But that's the basic stuff. Some of the higher level stuff, you've got libgu, graphics utility, which is a very sort of simplified way of doing the 3D graphics. You've also got libgum, which is a matrix library built on top of that. So you can pass it basically a matrix stack, and it will do all the multiplies for you. There's a VFPU one already written, so you can actually gain the advantage of VFPU speed, but without actually having to write any of the code, which is obviously quite useful. But some people don't like to use the sort of Sony-ified sort of libraries, so there is a port of GL, and there's also SDL, which is mainly useful for the 2D graphics. It has OpenGL extensions in it, but it's primarily used for people who are trying to port across some emulators or something. You've got other ports we've done, libpng, libjpeg, free type, so if you need to load up resources, fonts, etc., you can do that using those. And then audio libraries. So, as I said near the start, the PSP can handle raw PCM. So if you can convert something into raw PCM, then you can run that on the PSP itself. The kernel does provide an inbuilt A-Track-free decoder, A-Track-free being Sony's proprietary music format, and that will not use any CPU time, or virtually no CPU time, because that runs on the media processor. So if you want the most amount of processing power you can do that and get virtually free audio playback. The downside being you've got to have it in A-Track-free format. But there's libmad, MP3, libog, libvorbis, etc. If you don't want that. There isn't a wide range of module playback software. There's micbod, and that's about it. So there is apparently a port of fmod, but as far as anyone can tell, it is purely for commercial use. For homebrew use, that's unfortunately not available. And I think the last slide, really, bit of joypad stuff. If you need to access the joypad for debugging purposes, etc., there we go. It's not very difficult. Again, you don't have to pull anything out of anything directly. You just call a function, and it will fill in all the information for you. Right. So, as I've now run out of time, I'll skip the security stuff. But any questions on that? I'm sorry it was a bit rushed and a bit boring, but good. Right. No? Cool. That's it. I'm afraid. You can now leave. Yeah. But I will be doing a more practical one tomorrow, which is slightly less dry, slightly less slidey, so it might be more interesting, maybe.